Well, thanks for having me up. Can you all hear me? I'm pretty loud. It sounds like there's kind of an echo, or maybe that's just the way it goes in there and bounces around. I don't know. Plenty of space for it. I'm glad you guys have me up. I'm glad to be here. We hear so much good stuff about the church up here, and we're doing good down there in Berkeley Springs. We've got a lot of characters. I brought one of the biggest characters with us here. Many of you know Tommy. He's up here with me. Dale also. And I brought my wife, Laura. I tell him at Berkeley Springs she's the luckiest woman I know. Have any of you heard our news, by the way? So I'm 45 this year. And went to the doctor the other day, and she's having twins. So I'm just pointing that out. I was going to say I brought my beautiful wife. I married her. One of the reasons was I married her for her looks. But I'm beginning to question some of the looks she gives me now in the first trimester. So I'll quit this. I'll get right into the text. I'll tell you what, this pulpit must be for giants. I mean, I feel like I could just lean right here. I went and heard a preacher about 20 years ago. I took my dad with me, and he would be preaching, this fella, and he would just go like this. Then he'd sort of go this way, and he'd just do that all night as he was preaching. I asked my dad what I thought, or what he thought of him. He said, "I never seen a preacher waller all over the pulpit that way." But this one right here, I could probably lay down. You are not allowed to lay down. You might go to sleep. If you do, please don't snore. Nehemiah. The book of Nehemiah. And I'm in particular, or have been assigned in particular, chapter 8 through 10. And we're to talk about the covenant. Now, is this a lecture series? Is that what we call this? I'm not a very good lecturer. If you don't believe me, just ask my family. I do mostly lecturing at the home and nobody listens. So I stick with preaching usually. So we'll try that. All right. Have you guys been studying at all in Nehemiah? So I may cover some things tonight that you've heard. I've got some things that I want to talk about, an introduction. And what time do I quit? Well, that's counting down, right? So when that's done, I need to stop, correct? There's no warning or anything, just the countdown. Okay, very good. Then I'll get started. I want to spend 15 minutes here talking about the introduction, and then I want to get into my lesson, and then I want to tell you a little bit more. So make sure your trays are in their upright position and get ready. Nehemiah was an official of a certain rank in the Persian court. He served under the monarch Artaxerxes. In case you get him confused with another Artaxerxes, it's Artaxerxes Longimanus. Just in case I don't want you to get him confused. By the way, at Berkeley Springs, they don't laugh at my jokes either, so don't feel bad. Tommy, he would laugh, but I'll tell a joke and Janie has to explain it to him for 5 minutes, and then you'll hear him laughing. But he's not to be confused with the Nehemiah who returned with under Zerubbabel and under Joshua the priest in Ezra chapter 2 and verse 2. Nehemiah was the cupbearer. Okay? Have they talked to you about what the cupbearer was yet? I don't want to repeat a lot of things. But the cupbearer did more than just bear the cup, okay? As a matter of fact, Herodotus speaks of the Persian cupbearer. I've often wondered if he wasn't speaking of Nehemiah himself, but he speaks of the cupbearer as being the one who stood next to the king. And he went on to say that the cupbearer is the one who held the ear of the king. And so how powerful was Nehemiah? Pretty powerful guy, wasn't he? And he gets a call from God. That's a word we use or hear a lot. Someone will say, well, I have a calling. I always thought my calling would be coon hunting. Turns out you don't make much money So I had to pick something else. Benjamin's laughing. When I went to preaching school in 2011, when all the other kids were home studying, because that's what they all did, wasn't it, Ben? They just studied constantly. I would go out on his ridge, and we coon hunted, just about every night sometimes. So, but I'll tell you what, it was a good time. We just didn't have a good dog. That's the problem. But Nehemiah's calling from God came at what we might think the most inopportune time. He has literally the best job in the world. He's the second man to the king of Persia. And he doesn't just live in a little cottage. Being the second man to the king in Persia, where do you think he lived? I would imagine the proximity was very close to the king's house. No doubt he lived in the very same palace. And here is a man who, to use Jesus' phrase concerning a rich man, Nehemiah certainly would have fared sumptuously living in that palace. And here then, he gets a burden. And his burden is for Jerusalem. He hears a rumor. Now, rumors never spread very quickly amongst God's people, do they? I'm surprised you all didn't hear that Laura was having twins. I'm surprised that that didn't make its way up here. We'll blame COVID for that one. But I'll tell you this. He hears something about Jerusalem. Is it because he misses Jerusalem? Is that it? That his burden is so heavy? Here's the fact. Nehemiah had never seen Jerusalem in his entire life. When he'd go to the house of prayer, they didn't even have a PowerPoint so he could see a picture of it. Why does he have such a burden for a place he's never been, for a place he's never seen? And I think as you learn more about Nehemiah's life, the more you have to respect him, admire him. Now then, Nehemiah, when we think of what the theme of the book is, we might expect it to be easy to pin it down. But I had trouble pinning down what the theme was. You say, well, that's why you have commentaries. They'll tell you what the theme is, right? Right there in the front. They always have the key verse, correct? But you see, Nehemiah, well, there's so much that we can learn from it. I think probably if there was a great theme or some personal application that we can make today, it has to be his role as a leader. And so we can learn quite a bit about leadership in the book of Nehemiah. Now, how many people here are leaders? No one's going to lead the way by raising their hand. All right, we got one leader. I want to tell you something. You know what the definition of a leader is? Someone who has influence on another. Yeah, I didn't know it was that simple either. Now, as Christians, our call in this lost world, if it's nothing else, it is no doubt to have an influence on everyone that we come in contact with, right? And so how many of us are called by God to be leaders in that aspect? Well, I think every one of us. Think about how the early church was able to affect the world that it lived in. I mean, you could not, there is no way you could project or prophesy what was going to happen to the early church. If you were a betting man, the odds were against you that the church was going to grow. Here is a small group of 12 men. Their leader was killed. They went about preaching Jesus. Their own countrymen tried to kill them. They spread out into the world because of persecution. The Romans, that is, the leaders of the day, tried to oppress them, tried to put them down, tried to kill them. And yet, within just a few hundred years, they turned the world completely upside down for Christ. How do you think they did it? Because of their influence. Their influence. Can you influence anybody? I worked, I think I told the folks at Berkeley Springs this. I worked at one of the largest case, C-A-S-E, you know, those front-end loaders and excavators and all that stuff. I worked at a case dealership for a couple years. Only job I ever had that paid insurance. I'll just throw that out there. Down home where I come from, you work for nothing if they have benefits. But I enjoyed the job, and we would go up in the top room, and everyone would eat at this big table. And we all took our lunch, and we all ate there, and I would sit down, and before I would eat, I would just bow my head and say a silent prayer. And as I went along, I didn't go about preaching to my friends or the people you work with. You know, the people you work with, they don't always consider you as friends anyway. But I got along with everybody. And it was funny, when they began to find out that I was a preacher, it didn't surprise them. And one day, I did like I always did. It was only a few months into it, and I bowed my head, and the old fellow sitting right here, he said to the boy in front of me, he said, "Why don't you be still? Can't you see he's praying?" And then the old fellow said, "Well, why don't you just pray for all of us while you're at it?" You know what started to happen? Those 30 men every day before they'd eat, they'd say, "Preacher, you going to bless this so we can eat?" Isn't that amazing? I never preached at one of them. Now, as time went by, they would come and ask me things, and if they had problems in their life, they'd come, and I was able to make some sort of influence. But I'll tell you what, an example is the greatest quality that a leader can have. Now look at me. I'm definitely preaching. You guys wanted me to teach. Let me get back in this. The book extends over a period of about 12 years, from 445 to 433. By the way, Ezra and Nehemiah really go together. They are contemporaries. The ancient Jews, by the way, they had just simply the one book, Ezra and Nehemiah, together. Now, that is not to say I don't necessarily ascribe to the view that Ezra wrote the book of Nehemiah. I personally believe that Nehemiah wrote it. It seems from the way that he's speaking that he is the first person who is talking, and he's telling us the tale, if you will, or I should say the account of the matter. But it contains the account of Nehemiah himself and of the certain proceedings in which he engaged between the 20th and the 32nd or 33rd years of Artaxerxes' reign. It's the last of the Old Testament historical books. It's designed to be a supplement and complete the account of the return of the Jews from Babylonian captivity. That is, the captivity that's recorded by Ezra. And Ezra, of course, records the circumstances, and Nehemiah does. Nehemiah focuses primarily on the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem and the reforms that he introduced. Primarily, Ezra and Nehemiah were both great reformers. And something about these books, I was telling Laura when I was preparing this. She said, "I've never heard you give a lesson on Ezra and Nehemiah." And I thought, well, I don't, or maybe I told you that. Anyway, I can't remember the last time I preached out of Ezra. I have preached out of Nehemiah. But I read these books every time I go through the Bible, and there's not many notes in them. There's a lot of question marks. You know, you read the account, especially with Ezra, well, with Nehemiah also, and you'll see what happens. They bring this great reform, and then there seems to be an apostasy. And then there is something that is done seemingly by these reformers that make you question what's going on. The book of Nehemiah ends with him whipping people. Are you aware of that? I've been there. I've wanted to take people and just wring their necks because they won't come and obey the gospel. Have you ever felt that way? Isn't that terrible for me to admit? Especially when it comes to family. Someone says you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. If you hold his head under long enough, he's gonna, right? It reminds me of the time Raccoon John Smith. Have you all ever heard any stories about Raccoon? He was going along the way and he saw this Methodist preacher. He was sprinkling this baby, and the baby was just crying and kicking and screaming. And Raccoon was over 6 feet tall back in the 1800s. He's a pretty big fella. And he was walking along one day, and he started to preach. And he was out in the water, and he'd been baptizing people, and he saw the Methodist preacher walking. And he yelled to the Methodist preacher, he said, "Hey!" And he encouraged him to come on down. And he finally got him to come on down. He said, "Come a little farther." And he even walked out in the water. About that time, he took the preacher and shoved him under the water and held him while he was kicking and screaming. And he brought him up, and he said, "Elder John, what's wrong?" And about that time, he pushed him down in again. Now, this is all going on in front of an audience. Could you imagine that? About 3 times he did that. And he said, "Elder John, I cannot believe that you would do such a thing against my will." He said, "Well, now you know how that baby feels, right?" My favorite one that he said, this is the one Tommy likes. Someone said, "What's the difference between your invitation and the sinner's bench?" You know what the sinner's bench is? That's the bench where all the sinners come up and bow to and pray. They call it the old-fashioned altar. "What's the difference between your invitation, Elder Smith, and our sinner's bench?" He said, "One is from heaven, the other is from the sawmill." That was always my favorite one. Hey, let me get back on this. Here, Nehemiah, he is so aggravated. I mean, you think about what the Lord did when he came in and saw how they were treating the sanctuary of God. You remember he overthrows the tables and he makes whips? Now, why did he make the whips, by the way? And Nehemiah finds himself in that same place. And that's why I say when you study these books, you're left with questions, or at least I am, ones that are very hard to understand. That thing's counting down. It says I have 24 minutes. I better move on. So, in chapters 1 and 2, the writer narrates the circumstances under which he's engaged in the work of reconstructing the walls of the city. And he lets everyone know that he has the authority of the king. And so then, as we move along with the main narrative, chapters 3 through chapter 7, there is a list of families that returned. And then, from the close of chapter 7, the narrative is resumed again. And other lists are inserted, all the way to the end of the book. In Nehemiah chapter 7, if we were to compare it with Ezra chapter 2, you'll find that they're almost identical. Nehemiah tells us in Nehemiah chapter 7 and verse 5 that he found a register of the genealogies of those who went up at the first language, which plainly signifies that the list he gives was one which he found that was already existing. No doubt it might have been the same list that Ezra uses. But Nehemiah will go on from there to give a vivid picture of the conditions of the Jews at the time of the restoration. They are feeble. They are waiting. Do you ever feel that way in the Lord's church? I remember once down at the school preaching, "Jonathan, where are you at? Is he teaching or is he in here?" He heard I was preaching, so he took off. When I was at the school of preaching, I remember once some of the boys were getting in a heated argument about politics. I call them boys because I was the oldest one there by about 15 years. And Denver came in, and you know how he broke it up? He said, boys. Denver was 89. He could call us boys. Boys, I don't want to hear you arguing about politics. There's too much work in the kingdom of God for you to busy yourself with that nonsense. That doesn't mean there's not a place to sit around and talk about politics. But there's so much work to be done in the kingdom. So much that needs to be done. And Nehemiah, he has to deal with people. Being a good leader, sometimes one of the hardest things in the world to do is work with people. Because people are people, right? Now that's pretty profound, isn't it? But when you're working with people, sometimes that's very, very hard. And Nehemiah has to find a way. And Nehemiah is one of these guys that's all business. He says, I've come. The king has encouraged me. I've come with money. I've come with people. And I want to get this thing done. He was a good leader. As a matter of fact, he got her done quicker than I could. I think one of the greatest miracles of the Bible was how quickly Nehemiah was able to get those walls built. It's amazing what he was able to do. But he finds a feeble people. The prophets spoke about the people of God numerous times. And by the way, Haggai is a contemporary. Zechariah, the book of Malachi. These books give us a picture of what God's people were going through. And sometimes it's bleak. And most of the time, they're not doing what they ought to do. But when they come back, you would think, after 70 years, that they would come back and just be on fire, right? Well, it didn't work that way. Here, he finds people who are opposed to him. There is the sneer of Sanballat that a fox might break down their walls. How about that? The list that's in chapter 7 gives us the whole congregation together. 42,360. And of servants, 7,337. And 245 singers. Now, the weakness of the congregation is seen when this number is compared with the times when Judah alone numbered 470,000 warriors in 1 Chronicles chapter 21 and verse 5. I've tried to get a number on the percentage of people that came back from Babylon. Now, how long were they in Babylon? 70 years, right? How many people, and by the way, this is long after that. Nehemiah is not the first group that came back. But how many people do you think came back? The percentage is very low. As a matter of fact, that shouldn't surprise us. The prophets, Jeremiah and those other prophets, would speak of the captivity, and they told them, build homes, start businesses. They told them that because they were going to be there for a long time. And there is still a large Jewish, well, not so much anymore, but for most of the centuries after the Babylonian captivity, there were Jews who lived in the Babylonian area. I lived in Israel for a year, and I stayed with a Jewish family who lived in the Babylonian area. My sugar might be a little high. Tommy took me to King's, and he said they got the best steak hoagie in here. And it was good. It was real good. And I told my wife to order spaghetti. See, I went on a diet 8 months ago, and I cut out everything that has any flavor. You might say, man, Josh, you're pretty fat now. How fat were you back then? Well, it was pretty big. I'd have needed this pulpit then. So I told her, order spaghetti. Now, I did that because I know that being in her first trimester, she ain't going to eat hardly any of it. And because I didn't want to leave it out in the car to spoil, I knew I better eat it. That's the first time I've had spaghetti for a while. The reason I'm telling you that story is because I'm having trouble with my words. I told Dale, I'm not worried about the sugar. It's like my old steel chainsaw. I mix it a little rich, and I seem to run better when I'm a little rich. But here then, we find quite a bit concerning the commentary of the lives of the Jews. They had their businesses. They lived and thrived in Babylon. And the question might be, if you had a good business and you had a good job and all your kids lived in Babylon and all your grandkids lived in Babylon and all your great-great-grandkids lived in Babylon, you think you'd want to up and move thousands of miles away to a place where the walls are so crumbled and so feeble that a fox could break through them at any time? How about that? I mean, it's not like in your old age getting in the RV and heading to Florida. This is the worst place in the world you can go to. There's nothing there. All that is there is trouble. By the time Christ comes on the scene, Judea is the last place that anyone wants to be. And so here then, these people come back. They don't come back in droves. Only certain ones do. And when they get there, they start building. News of the afflictions of his people at Jerusalem and of the ruined condition of the walls reached the Persian court. And it caused Nehemiah profound grief. So he sought and obtained leave to go to Jerusalem and to build the broken city. He kept his secret, or his mission, kind of a secret in the beginning. He planned the work he set himself to do. He partitioned out the task to people that he knew who could work, and all of them worked simultaneously. And as we said, in a little more than 7 weeks, the entire wall was repaired and restored to its full height. Notice Nehemiah chapter 6 and verse 15. I've got 14 minutes. I better hurry up. 6:15. So the wall was finished in the 25th day of the month, Elul, in 52 days. I don't suppose he had to worry about OSHA regulations. That's staying pretty busy, isn't it? He kept his mission. Strong doors were set in the gateway. Guards were established. The gates were kept closed from nightfall until the sun was hot. Nehemiah chapter 7 and verse 3. And when you consider Nehemiah's administration at Jerusalem, it wasn't less than 13 years. And he governed with the same vigor, the same promptness, and the same energy which marked the opening months of his work. His hospitality could be seen in how he treated both those who were native and those who were foreign. He was generous. You'll find that in Nehemiah 5:14 through 18. He augmented the population of Jerusalem. He brought men in from country districts out in the country to work on the city. Something else he did, and I don't know that I want to spend too much time on it, but I think it's important. He redeemed a large number of Jews who had been sold into slavery among the heathen people, and he brought them back to their native land. He also put an end to the system of borrowing money, which had been of the most oppressive sort. The Bible had always warned of usury. He enforced the strict observance of the Sabbath. What's that mean? How many times will you keep the Sabbath? It doesn't tell you how many Sabbaths to keep in a year. It says keep the Sabbath. Keep it holy. And so what do you think was happening? Do you think some people were being slack in the way they kept the Sabbath? Some were probably working on the Sabbath. Well, he enforced a strict observance and the annual payment for the temple service, Nehemiah 10. Nehemiah, like Ezra, compelled all those who had married foreign wives to divorce them. Again, this is sort of a bizarre situation that we read of here. As a matter of fact, you don't really read of anything like this happening anywhere else in the Bible. These men were strict. They were prompt. They were uncompromising. He wouldn't allow any relaxation of the old law. No departure from the old ways. And no consorting with foreigners. Would to God that the church could learn a lesson from that today. When we look out across the denominations, we say, well, look how good their programs are going. Now, I want to tell you a little secret. Their programs aren't going as well as you think they are. And they never have. Fact of the matter is, if Nehemiah was here today, he'd tell you the same thing I'm about to tell you. Stick to the Bible. The prophet would say, walk in the old paths. Well, for fear of not preaching too much, I think that I'll get down to the point here. What were the results of this? First of all, it cured the Jews of strange gods. When you come to the New Testament, you find out very quickly that they don't have a problem with idol worship, that thing that plagued them for so long. Secondly, the restoration didn't set Israel in the place they had lost. There was no Shekinah glory in the most holy place. There was no Urim, there was no Thummim. There was no national independence. There was no freedom. They were still subject to Persia, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans. And finally, their temple would be destroyed. From the return from Babylon to the appearing of Jesus, we read of no miracle or miraculous intervention of God. To borrow words from the Hebrew writer concerning the Jewish dispensation, 400 years of silence, and the fact can be said, as the Hebrew writer did, the dispensation waxes old and is ready to vanish away. Now then, by the way, am I supposed to be asking for questions or anything, or I'm not? Well, that's good. If you have any questions, you'll have to ask somebody else. Here are some key verses for you. Boy, I wish I had time. 1 in verse 3, 1 in 11, and 6, verse 15 through 16. We may go back if we have time. One of the most amazing things is the wall was built in 52 days. Nehemiah leaves for a little bit. And then he comes back and he finds apostasies. Look at chapter 13 and verse 25. And I contended with them. This is Nehemiah talking. He's talking to these apostates. I contended with them and cursed them and smote certain of them and plucked off their hair and made them swear by God, saying, ye shall not give your daughters unto their sons, nor take their daughters unto your sons, or for yourself. Now, if cursing at them and kicking and screaming doesn't get it done, pulling out a clump of hair will motivate people pretty quickly, wouldn't it? It's interesting to me what he's so concerned about. Brothers and sisters, I would to God that the church today took marriage as seriously as those prophets of old did. His contemporary Malachi would say, God hates divorce. But one of the most saddest statistics that exist today is that the divorce rate amongst God's people isn't much different than the divorce rate amongst the world. And maybe one of the biggest reasons is because God's people keep mingling with the world. Well, there I am preaching again. Leadership. Remember how we define that? People who have influence. I'm going to take the rest of my time here and discuss 4 simple things that we can learn from the book of Nehemiah. This was just going to be sort of the last 15 minutes of my lesson, but we've got 8 minutes and 31 seconds. People who have influence, people who are leaders, must have a heart that is burdened. Notice in the book of Ezra, chapter 7. In Ezra, chapter 7 and verse 10, the Bible says, For Ezra had prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord. And then what does it say? And to do it, and to teach Israel's statutes and judgments. Notice that. He had prepared his heart to seek the law. Is our heart prepared? Do we have any kind of burden? Here, we need to have a heart that is burdened. Now, here is Nehemiah. He's never even seen Jerusalem. But in his heart, there is a great burden. He wants to do something. You see, burden will motivate you. One of these days, I'd like to get back to Israel. I sometimes think that Laura had these twins all planned out, so I couldn't go. She's maniacal enough to do such a thing. But I'll tell you this, I have a burden for Israel. I'd like to go back there, and I could even die over there. A grave site on the Mount of Olives is I saw one go for $2.5 million the other day, Laura. So you ought to be able to take care of that. But I have a burden. I was there for a year, and it disturbs me so much that there isn't a faithful Church of Christ in Jerusalem. Now, there's one there, but it's the farthest thing from faithful I ever saw. Isn't that a shame? The place where it all started. You can't find a sound church. Here, burden. Now, you can't force people to have a good heart. You can't force them to have a burden. I tried that with my kids. I wanted both of my kids to be the finest fiddle players around. I thought, man, I've had these 2 kids. By the way, I've got 2 adult children, and I'm starting on 2 more. Go ahead and get it out of your system right now. But I thought they're both going to be fine fiddlers. And when you know it, I drove them to a teacher. I never had a teacher whenever I learned to play music. I drove them to the teacher, paid for their lessons, and I mean, it was like pulling teeth to get them to practice or play or do anything. I had a burden that they'd be great fiddlers. They wanted nothing to do with it. And you see, sometimes that happens, even in the Lord's church. Don't we have a burden for our children? For those people that we sit next to, we see them growing up, and our biggest fear is that when they get older, we're not going to see them again. And you can't force them to do anything, can you? If you've had children, you know just as well as I do, you can't force them to do anything. I always stayed out of my kids' decisions when it came to who they were dating. I knew that if I'd pick a fella that I liked, they'd want nothing to do with him. I know this because I found one I liked. He looked a lot like me. I generally like to wear blue jeans and a plaid shirt. And by the way, you girls who complain about wearing heels, I wear heels every day of my life. You won't find me without my cowboy boots. And this boy, dressed just like me, wore cowboy boots, played the fiddle, going to Fried-Hardeman to be a preacher. And I thought, the search is over. How do you think that went over? Not very well, right? Here, he had a burden. So we need to have a heart that is burdened. Secondly, if we're going to be good leaders, we have to pray and not delay. You know, there are 9 prayers in the book of Nehemiah. Prayer, I'll just say this right now. Prayer expresses our priorities. You want to know what your priorities are? What is it that you pray for? I was reading recently, I love history, okay? And I was reading recently about a hotel in London. As a matter of fact, I looked it up on YouTube today to find out where it was. It's the Gainsborough Hotel in Bath, England. Bath appeals to me because we are the sister city of Bath down there at Berkeley Springs. And in Bath, England, which is near London, the only natural hot springs that exist in that country are right there. And if you went to the Gainsborough Hotel, you could sort of go adjacent to it, and you could go into the hot springs and enjoy the springs. And so it draws tourists every year. And just recently, they were excavating there at the Gainsborough Hotel, and they found that pilgrims were coming to the hot springs, and they were really popular 2,000 years ago during the time of Christ. Okay? You know that Hadrian came to England. That great Hadrian's Wall was there, and the Romans were in that area. And so about 2,000 years ago, it was very popular to come, and you would bathe in those hot springs, but the hot springs were also a place that was very spiritual to these people. Generally, where there is water, there is pagan rituals. And so you would go in there, and you would get your bath. There's no way I would allow any hot tubs before our service. I have trouble with our people staying awake now, right? Here they come in, they get in the hot tub, and then they pay this fella, and he takes and chisels something into a tablet. And the curious thing that they found here recently in the excavation, they found these tablets. And what they were, there were many of them, they were prayer tablets. And so you would pay the priest to chisel your prayer into the tablet, and then they would take it and they would bury it. And what's interesting is, the most popular prayer, can you think of what it might be? 2,000 years ago in England? What do you think the most popular prayer would be? Oh, you're a brave bunch up here. I'll tell you what the most popular prayer was. They were prayers of vengeance. As a matter of fact, the archaeologists have jokingly, they have stopped calling them prayer tablets, and now they're referring to them as curse tablets. I'll give you an example of one. I wrote it down here in ink. It's right in front of me. Dosimedas, he has a prayer request. It says, he had lost a pair of gloves, and he asked that the person who stole his pair of gloves lose not only his mind, but both of his eyes. Now, I don't know about you, I've had some pretty good pairs of gloves, okay? But that's quite a curse, isn't it? And there are hundreds of these. You want to find out what your priorities are in 8 seconds? You want to find out what your priorities are? You might ask the question, what do I pray the most about? Nehemiah prayed 9 times in this book. In the first prayer, he addresses God as the God of heaven. You know why he does that? Because that was the term that the Babylonians used for their god. A god by the name of Ahura Mazda. Sounds like a Japanese car, doesn't it? They called him the God of heaven. And Nehemiah is saying to everybody, the God of heaven. And in his prayer, In chapter 1 and verse 6, he said, I have prayed day and night. Is there anything that you pray about day and night? I'm sure there is. Well, I'm done. What do I do now? Do I still stand up here or do I sit down? So I just morph right into the invitation then. How long do I got for that? How long y'all got? Well, maybe I'll just keep going here. How about that? I was going to talk about baptism. Does that surprise you that a Church of Christ preacher was going to go to baptism? I might before the night's up. Finally, confession is something we read about. In chapter 1 and verse 6 of Nehemiah, let thine ear now be attentive and thine eyes open, that thou mayest hear the prayer of thy servant, which I pray before thee now, day and night, for the children of Israel thy servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against thee. Both I and my father's house have sinned. Confession. Pretty important, isn't it? When it comes to the subject of tonight, which was the renewal of the covenant, which was to be my last 15 minutes, I think we'll say a few words concerning it. In Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 34, we read of a new covenant. A new covenant was needed because the old wasn't working. Do you realize the Hebrew writer, when speaking of the Old Covenant, said it made nothing perfect? And the Greek word that is used there indicates that it was useless when it came to making men perfect. Some of you women might say, everything's useless when it comes to making perfect men, right? What was he talking about there? He was saying that the old law was useless when it came to fixing the problem of sin. In Jeremiah chapter 31, you read of this promise. Now, most of you ought to know about this promise. It shouldn't come as a surprise. But in Jeremiah 31, and we're going to begin with verse 31, he says this, Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that they took them out of the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they break, although I was a husband unto them, saith the Lord. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, saith the Lord, I will put my law in their inward parts, and I will write it in their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And if you turn over to Ezekiel chapter 36, you find the prophet in Ezekiel say it this way. And it's very close, but in Ezekiel chapter 36, beginning in verse 24, he says this, For I will take you from among the heathen, I will gather you out of all the countries, and I will bring you into your own land. Now listen here. Then will I sprinkle clean water upon you, and ye shall be clean. For all your filthiness and from all your idols will I cleanse you. A new heart also will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you. And I will take away the stony heart out of the flesh, and I will give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you, and cause you to walk in my statutes. And you shall keep my judgments, and do them. And ye shall dwell in the land that I gave your fathers. And ye shall be my people, and I will be your God. You see, there has to be a burden of the heart. And Nehemiah had that. And we've got to have it today, because this new covenant that was coming was a covenant of the heart. It's one where the problem of sin would be fixed. If they would only confess those sins, would God be just to forgive them? The question could be asked today. If we confess our sins as children of God, is he not just and faithful to forgive us of them still? Is there still not power in the blood to forgive us? Here he says, I will sprinkle clean water upon you. Ye shall be clean. Is that the end of my invitation? Where was I? Oh, I was about getting to the water, Jonathan. That's what I was doing. Confession. Listen. God does the cleaning. God does the washing. It doesn't matter how filthy you were. Here he points out that no matter how filthy you are, I will cleanse you from all your filthiness and from all your sins. Have you ever heard of a man by the name of Chris Lambrioni? Chris Lambrioni is an interesting fella. He was a gangster in London. Let me ask you this. Have you ever heard of the Cray brothers? The Cray brothers were the most notorious gangsters that Europe ever produced. We had Al Capone, Lucky Luciano. I could go through the list. I always loved the mafia. When I was a kid, I had a big picture of The Godfather in my room. And I'm not allowed to watch it at my house because for 2 weeks I slick my hair back and speak with an Italian accent. But in London, they had the Cray brothers. And Chris, he worked for them. And Chris was arrested and sentenced to 15 years for aiding and abetting in a murder. What happened is the Cray brothers killed Jack the Hat. Here's a name for you. You'll never guess why they called him Jack the Hat. I'll have to let you figure that one out. But the Cray brothers had Jack the Hat killed. And here a young Chris, he is commissioned by the Cray brothers to take Jack the Hat, to throw him in the trunk of one of those vehicles. This wasn't too long ago. Some of you probably had a vehicle like that. My first car was a 1970 Pontiac Bonneville. You could fit 10 bodies in that trunk. And it had a 455 engine in it. You could probably get away with it. So they threw him in this trunk and they took him down by the river and they buried him and they thought they got away with it. And Chris was happy and all was well until he was caught and he was thrown into prison. And here this man, he was so furious. And what appealed to me was this part of his story. They put him in solitary, in a jail cell of his own. And he gets mad, and the first thing he does is he throws the bed, he breaks the sink, he kicks everything. When he throws the bed up, he sees that there's one gift in there for him. It's a box, and there's a few books in there. And he takes the first book and tears it up and throws it against the wall. And he does that with about 3 other books. And finally, he picks the last one up and he gets ready to throw it to the wall. And in telling this story, he said it was like glue. He looked down and here it was the Bible. And he calmed down. And he thought, nothing's going to help me in this place. But he'd heard the Bible would help him. And so he slept with the Bible under his pillow that night and thought about killing himself. And he got up the next morning and he realized that Bible must have helped him. Before long, it wasn't doing much for him, and he thought, well, I can at least roll cigarettes out of its paper. And he decided to open it up one day, and you know what he found? He found John 10 and verse 10. I have come that you might have life. And the promises grabbed him. What Nehemiah and Ezra did when they came to rebuild the city, do you know what the first thing they did after they prayed? They gathered the people together and they read the Bible together. They read the promises. Yes, they read the promise way back in Deuteronomy that said they were going to end up in exile. Isn't that amazing that God already told them all the way back when Moses was given the law that they would end up where they were? But they also reminded God of his promises in Isaiah. of which Isaiah said they would come back and God would bless them and God would renew them. And folks, if you are here tonight and you struggle with wondering what your salvation is going to be, I want you first of all to know that you're not alone. We all doubt at times. But you see, what Nehemiah teaches us and what Ezra teaches us is that we can go to this word and remember the promises. Did you notice what Ezekiel said? I will cleanse you, and I will put in you a new heart and a new spirit. Now, I told you I'd get the baptism, and I'm heading straight to John chapter 3. You remember John chapter 3? What's John chapter 3 about? Being born again. And I think one of the most curious passages in that chapter is found in verse 10, when Jesus tells them, you've got to be born of what? You've got to be born of the water and of the Spirit. And Nicodemus has trouble here. You remember Nicodemus comes to him at night. I always thought I'd preach a sermon and call it Nick at Night. Here he comes. And you remember what Jesus said to Nicodemus in verse 10? Art thou a master of Israel and knowest not these things? You might say, well, that's new doctrine. No one had ever heard that you needed to be born of the water and of the Spirit. No one had ever heard that unless you go back to Ezekiel and you look at the covenant and he says, I will sprinkle you with water. I will wash you. I will take out the old stone and I'll give you a new heart. And Nicodemus should have known that in order to become a child of God, you couldn't thrive with stone in your veins. You had to have a new heart. And which way did they find to have a new heart? They would be washed. And Nehemiah chapter 8 and verse 3, when Nehemiah preaches his sermon, do you know what he preached it in front of? He preached it in front of the water gate. Folks, there is water in the plan. And tonight, if you're not a Christian, we want you to think about the covenant. 13 times the word better is used in the book of Hebrews, and it's talking about the covenant. Won't you come?